In the beginning, God created, and it was good. God gave man one rule: don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, lest man die. Man did what God told him not to do, and he ate of the tree. And in doing so, man harmed his relationship with God. This relationship needed fixed. God had a solution to fix the relationship. And over the course of 1,000 years or so, God shared details about this solution through authors that wrote down what we call the Old Testament. Jewish readers would know these writings as the Tanakh. We've been trying to answer the question, does the Old Testament make a sufficient case that Jesus was the solution to fix this harmed relationship between man and God? I haven't actually worded it quite that way before, but we're adults. We know that's what we're trying to show. And so that's what we're looking at.
As the source. You keep saying the source.
As the source.
Yes,
Yeah.
you've been saying the source for the past week.
Exactly. So, but if we were to look at things as closely as we can in Christ's time and the years before that, and if we look at the information that they had available, would it be logical to conclude that Jesus was God's solution, or would it have been tough for them to figure out? That's kind of what we're looking at. We had our first bit of information about God's solution. Where did we get the first instance? Genesis 3. So just literally a few verses after they ate of the fruit, where we were told that it would be a man from the line of Eve, and it would bruise the serpent's head, and that the serpent would bruise this man's heel. From there, we made our way through the rest of the Pentateuch, or the Torah, as the Jewish people know it, and chronologically, we headed through the rest of the Tanakh. We're part of the way through Psalms, and we've come up with the following summaries. If we were a Jew from that time, and we were looking forward to see if something could be the solution, it would be good to have clues as to what we should keep an eye out for. We've learned so far that it's going to be someone from the line of Judah. So that means if we're paying attention to someone from the line of Ishmael, Levi, Benjamin, whoever else, we don't need to worry about them because we know that the solution is going to be from the line of Judah. And we know there's going to be a star. Additionally, we have some metrics that God has given us for testing a possible solution. If we have something that we say, is this the solution? Let's say we have a star. Let's say we have someone from the line of Judah. And let's say they're doing something interesting. What do the events in this person's life or surrounding this person show us about whether or not this person is a solution? So we have various ways that we can test it. We know that it's going to be an ultimate act of love and justice. God said that ye shall surely die if you eat of the fruit, so we know there's going to be death. And we have a bunch of other things. I'm not going to go through each one of these, but this is the list that we've compiled so far. As a reminder, the Psalms that we've been going through were written by King David around 1044 BC, over 1,000 years before Christ. If we compared this to today, this would be like looking at something that was written around 1000 AD, 10 centuries ago. David had just received the Davidic covenant from Nathan. David's throne forever had been foretold. He knew his offspring was going to build the temple. He still had various life issues going on, but he was firmly established as the king for what we're talking about right now. The next psalm that we're going to look at is quoted more in the New Testament than any other psalm. We are not going to go through this next psalm as a way to know what to look for in a solution to the relationship problem, because frankly, I don't think that any reasonably logical person would be able to read what David had written and think that this was describing the solution to the problem. But when we look at this psalm and think about using what is written here as a way to test for whether or not something is a solution, we're going to find some interesting things. Things David wrote that frankly would have stumped the people of his day. And David himself might not have had a very clear idea of why he was writing some of these things that God had inspired him to write. I mentioned last time, though, that we're coming up on a psalm that the scholars often call the Psalms of the Cross. A little bit of context on that. The primary method of killing those who deserved it in David's time was stoning. That's what was talked about in the Mosaic Law, and that was the primary method they used to kill those who deserved it. And also by the sword. We had stoning and the sword. Crucifixion had not been invented at the time that this was written. Crucifixion showed up thanks to the Persians in the 6th century BC. We're 400 or so years before that with what we're writing here. Crucifixion was obviously a horrific way to die, as the Persians admitted. Being nailed naked to the cross, embarrassed for everyone to see, dying a slow, painful death as your body's strength gives out. So we start out with the Psalms of the Cross. Psalms 22. Verse 1, David is talking. He starts out with these words. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me and from the words of my groaning? Maybe this reminds you of something else. My God, why have you forsaken me? This wording might warm the cockles of your heart. Does this 9-word question, is that proof of anything, though? Having it here? Frankly, not really. Just because we know that this is what Jesus is going to say on the cross.
He quoted a lot of Old Testament scripture.
Exactly. This shows us that Jesus knew the writings of David. That's what we really can figure out from this. Even though we might like reading this and we might go, oh, I recognize that. This just simply shows us that Jesus knew the writings of David. That's really it. But as we continue on in this chapter, pay attention to the specificity of what David had written, beyond just simply this one thing right here, and look at how everything fits together. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This is what we're going to talk about in the second half of the study when we look at the New Testament and see how well it points back. At this point, though, we're looking forward. We're looking at what the people of this time, back in Psalms, would have known. And this verse would not have made them think of another famous verse, like it does with us. Moving forward a few verses, though, in verses 6 through 8, but I am a worm and no man, a reproach of men, and despised by the people. That might remind you of something. All those who see me ridicule me. They shoot out the lip. They shake the head, saying, he trusted in the Lord. Let him rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him. We're starting to see a collection of things here. We don't just have,
You know the context of when David wrote this song?
Well, it was right after Nathan had delivered the covenant to him. Now, there were obviously other things going on in his life. He was having various life issues. There were probably some people that did not like him as king.
But he wasn't running from Saul at this point. You
Nope.
would think that he had written this during the Saul.
Actually, I was thinking more of Absalom when he went away and people were throwing stones at him.
We're going to get to Absalom. I think he might be the next chapter we hit, or the one after that. So this, from what the people have been able to figure out, would have been before Absalom.
Interesting.
But, obviously he was king. Not everyone likes the king under any circumstances. So he was going through some things. But look at how specific this is about the things that he's describing that he's going through. It's going to be despised by the people. Everyone's going to ridicule him. They're going to laugh at him. They're going to shake their head saying, he trusted in the Lord. Let the Lord save him. This wouldn't have had a lot of relevance for David beyond like what I had mentioned. Maybe he was going through just the fact that people didn't like him as king. The people might have thought he was just being poetic without really understanding what he was meaning. I don't know. We don't know exactly. If we go ahead a few more verses, verse 14. I'm poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. Poured out like water. He doesn't have any water. It's like this is giving the symbolism of being dehydrated, like a man suffering under the hot sun. Bones are out of joint. When David wrote this, it would have been a bit hard to understand what that would have meant because a method of capital punishment had not yet been invented, which caused excruciating pain by having one's bones literally slip out of joint as strength leaves the body. That capital punishment method was going to be invented a few hundred years later. But David is writing this now. My heart is like wax, it's melted within me. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, or however you say that. And my tongue clings to my jaws. It's so dry that it sticks to the sides of my mouth. There's no liquid in there. I'm just so parched. You have brought me to the dust of death. So thirsty that the word dust is used in conjunction with death. This would not have made sense to people with respect to David. David would not have been here. Yet David wrote this. Moving forward just a little bit farther. For dogs. What do we know about dogs from the Bible? Do we have dogs used to represent anyone, anything? Any ideas on that? Where have you seen dogs?
Samaritans?
It's a people group.
They said they licked their wounds.
The lepers?
Gentiles.
What?
Matthew 15. The passage describes an encounter between Jesus and the Canaanite woman. She asks Jesus to heal her daughter. He initially responds, "It's not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs," meaning that he was there for the Jews and not for the Gentiles. So keep that in mind when we see the word dogs here. For dogs have surrounded me, Gentiles. The congregation of the wicked has enclosed me. They pierced my hands and feet. Why would David have been writing this? They pierced my hands and feet. I can count all my bones. For you to be able to count all your bones, you can't be wearing any clothes because you can't see them otherwise. They look and stare at me. Crucifixion was done in a way to embarrass people as much as possible. They look and stare at me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Psalms 22, written 1,000 years before Christ.
Help me to understand, if you would, the transition between dogs and Gentiles, because it wasn't the Gentiles that crucified Christ.
Romans were Gentiles.
Yeah, the Romans were there.
But
Yeah,
who set all that in motion?
the Jews did, certainly. But the Romans were the ones that were around him.
Yeah, the Jews would not have been able to kill him
Without
without the
consent.
Romans.
Without
Yep.
the consent of the Roman
Because
government.
they had to have the Romans involved.
And I will also share that this is not the only time we're going to see the Gentiles. They're going to show up several more times as being involved in this prophecy.
And we definitely know about, it was the guards who cast lots, they would have been Gentiles. Actually, the peoples on each cross beside him would have been Gentiles.
But I love this question, though.
They pierced my hands.
I love the question, though, because this is how we need to think about this. We need to think about what we're reading critically and say, is this a fair connection to make? Is this valid? And I keep asking, each person here should be asking that question. Would this convince me?
Because it wasn't the Jews that actually pierced the hands, it was the Gentiles that did. It was they looking to stare at me, maybe everybody was, but they divide my garments.
Yeah.
So without the Gentiles,
It
Christ
wouldn't have
been
happened.
crucified. Without the Jews, Christ wouldn't have been crucified. 'Cause
Yes.
there would have been no authority to do so.
Everyone was involved.
I think he's talking about everyone together. I mean, you got
Right.
the Romans, the Gentiles, you got the Jews.
Yep.
You know, you got everybody. I think he's talking to the dogs. He's specifically talking about the dogs. He's talking about the whole group of people that were against Christ to begin with.
Well, and we'll hear more about the Jews
That's kind
also.
of what I was thinking, Billy.
Yeah.
Is that dogs is just
Everybody.
Just
you
everybody.
dog, you know?
Yeah. And then that could be, but we do have other references in the Bible.
Definitely dogs were not looked at upon with favor as they are
No.
today.
No,
Yeah, definitely not.
They don't run down to the Humane Society and adopt them?
no.
No.
So it's the common slang term for Gentiles
Yes.
of the day.
Probably the dogs were most associated with the shepherds, because they would help look after the sheep.
That's true. Yeah, possibly so.
Morning, Ralph. Morning, Sam.
Yeah.
The reality is we're all dogs. Okay,
Yeah, we're all dogs.
Moving on.
Right.
moving on.
So the people of David's day, like I mentioned, they would have wondered about a lot of these things that have been written. It
Charles got it.
simply would not have made any sense to them. David talking about having his hands and feet pierced, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
This would not have made sense to them. These are the things that they should have been pondering in their hearts, though. As crucifixion came on the scene 400 years later, and they learned about this method of capital punishment, perhaps a slow realization could have occurred in their minds, where they said to themselves, that thing David was talking about, that kind of fits with this crucifixion thing that we're seeing now. And they could have started to form a better picture in their mind of the events surrounding this solution that we're talking about. This is something that we'll continue to see as we learn more and more about ways to test the solution. What we read might not make sense at the time it was written, but as the world catches up to God's plan and God's timing, things that might have started very, very murky might start to make more sense to the observant student. So we've added several items over here. He's mocked. There's a crucifixion that's being talked about. His hands and feet are going to be pierced. He's thirsty. We have lots being cast. We now find ourselves in Psalms 110. Note that we skipped a lot of Psalms 22. I encourage you to go back and read through it verse by verse. I hit the high points, the things that I really felt pointed towards a solution, but by all means, it's a really impressive Psalms to read. So certainly have that on your list if you have not reviewed it lately. Next, we're moving on to Psalms 110, though. As I mentioned last week, when we see the word Lord in all capital letters, that was Hebrew for the actual word that they had for God. So we're talking about God Himself when we see Lord in all capital letters. That's not just an interpretation or a translation or anything like that, like whenever we see a word that has just the first letter capitalized, like he and him. When we see that, that means that someone that's translated it thinks that it's referring to Jesus or God. But when we see Lord in all caps, we know that it's the actual word for God. Now, the thing that's interesting about that, let's look at what we see here. The Lord, the actual God, said to my Lord. This is King David that's talking. So King David is saying, God said to my Lord. The king did not have a Lord at that time, typically. The king was the Lord at that time. The king was the top. The king was at the pinnacle. So when David is saying, God is talking to my Lord, that would have gotten their attention because David is saying something special there. Does that make sense? David's putting someone in between him and God.
Yahweh.
That would have caught their attention. So, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. we can have this part about sitting at God's right hand. We had hit that before, but we're seeing it again here. The Lord shall send the rod of your strength out of Zion, rule in the midst of your enemies. Then in verse 4, the Lord has sworn and will not relent. You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. Help me out here and let me know that my past teaching has not been entirely in vain. Who was Melchizedek?
He was a priest.
He was the head dude, the head priest.
If you
Ahead of
can,
Moses.
yeah. What was very briefly? What was his story?
Abraham. Was
Abraham?
it Abraham?
Yeah, he showed up to Abraham.
He showed, yes. And because he was a priest, Abraham tithed to him.
Yes, and so we are being told here that this Lord that's sitting in between David and God is going to be a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. We don't really get much else about Melchizedek until we get to Hebrews, which obviously these people would not have had. But we're going to go ahead and put down that this solution is going to be a forever priest. We're not going to be able to use that to look forward to say, okay, this guy's going to be from the line of Judah and there's going to be a star. But whenever we're looking backwards and we're saying, okay, was Jesus the solution? Then we have forever priest that we can point to. That Jesus was playing the role of being the priest forever. So that gives us one more thing that we can look back at. David wrote a lot of different psalms in this time period right after he'd gotten the Davidic covenant, where he found out that he was going to be on the throne forever and those things. Next, we're going to go to Psalms 118. In Psalms 118, David again is speaking, and he indicates that God has a gatekeeper. This is the gate of the Lord, through which the righteous shall enter. So there's going to be something that controls who can get in to God.
And it's not St. Peter. You're gonna hear all of the jokes.
Yeah.
Standing at the gate, at the pearly gates?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Deciding,
Yeah.
interviewing.
exactly.
What's,
I hadn't thought of that one, but that's good.
what's the best?
What's the best?
Faith.
This is the gate of the Lord, through which the righteous shall enter. I will praise you, for you have answered me and have become my salvation. Interesting wording. David is saying that this thing that's setting between God and him will become David's salvation. And the stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. The stone that has been rejected is going to become the most important stone of all. As I'm sure you are aware, the cornerstone was the first stone that they put down when they were building a new building, and everything else was based on that one stone. So you had to get that one stone perfect. That was the cornerstone. So the stone that everyone else rejected becomes the most important stone of all. This cornerstone is going to be mentioned again later in the Old Testament, but it's more clear to me here that this is pointing towards a solution than it is later on. So this is the one that I'm bringing up. So the solution is going to be a gateway to God, and it's going to go from being rejected to being the most important. Questions on that? We're done with this part of David's life, and we're getting ready to hop forward about 20 years. Recall that I had said that David went through several events and situations in his life that were similar to what Jesus would have gone through. And now we're at the part that Pastor Joel had mentioned, where David is dealing with his son Absalom. Absalom had decided that he wanted to be king. And as was vogue in the day, the way to accomplish that was to kill the king. And so Absalom was trying to kill his dad, King David. David is on the run, trying to escape from Absalom. And during this time, in Psalms 55, where we're headed, David is praying to God about this situation. He wishes that God would take away would take him away from his troubles, and he's talking about that. So in verses 12 through 14, he says, "For it is not an enemy who reproaches me. Then I could bear it. Nor is it one who hates me, who has exalted himself against me. Then I could hide from him. But it was you, a man my equal, my companion and my acquaintance. We took sweet counsel together and walked to the house of God in the throng." We're going to add, betrayed by a friend. I'll be honest, I was tempted to not even include this, as well as a few of these recent ones, because I don't know that any modern logical person could look at that and say that that was talking about Judas, which is what we understand it to be talking about. But it's interesting to have here, due to the similarities between what David was going through and what we know is coming. But I'm not going to spend a lot more time talking about that. Now we're going to move forward 8 more years. David is nearing the end of his reign. He's about to pass. He has numerous psalms that he wrote at this time, right whenever he's at the end of his reign and at the end of his life. He's looking back on things. As we just read, David was very offended when Absalom was hurting him and hunting him. And 8 years later, during this time that we're getting ready to talk about, David wrote again that he had been betrayed by a friend. And if you want to write down in your notes, Psalms 41, he's talking about that there. I'm not going to go there on the screen, but that's another one for you to look at. And I'll leave that as an exercise for you. But just as an aside, I think that this points to the impact, both good and bad, that we can have on those we love. It was bothering David 8 years ago that his son was doing this to him. It didn't just go away. It continued haunting him.
What was the song number?
41.
41.
Yep. 41:9 specifically is where that's at. So we just need to keep that in mind with our relationships. Next, we're going to Psalm 69. Only Psalms 22, the Psalms of the Cross, is quoted more in the New Testament than Psalm 69. Psalm 69 is quoted in Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans. It's quoted in all those. And though it is understood as being a Psalm of David, because he's the one that wrote it, it also talks an awful lot about Jesus' life. And there are references to being hated without a cause, bearing reproach. In verse 8, it says, "I have become a stranger to my brothers and an alien to my mother's children." Typical language of the day would have said, "an alien to my father's children." Because the father was everything, the mother didn't really amount to much at that time. Interestingly, though, David says something that wouldn't have made a whole lot of sense anyway, that he was a stranger to his brothers and an alien to his mother's children. That wouldn't have really applied to David. But the way he says it is he says, "an alien to my mother's children." One could hypothesize that this was written from the standpoint of only having a blood relationship with the mother and perhaps not with the man who would be considered the father. Doesn't make a lot of sense with David, but it might make sense with a possible solution. So the wording here, the specific wording, is what makes this interesting. A reminder that this chapter is quoted more in the New Testament than anywhere else, but we're not going to hit most of it. We're just going to hit a little bit of it. Farther along in the chapter, we see in verse 20, "Reproach has broken my heart, and I am full of heaviness. I looked for someone to take pity, but there was none, and for comforters, but I found none." I wanted comfort, couldn't get any. Then verse 21, "They also gave me gall for my food, and for my thirst they gave me vinegar to drink.
Yeah. That's-
We have no recorded references of David ever being fed gall or vinegar. Yet David wrote this 1,000 years BC. Oddly specific, as though he was inspired to write using these exact words.
And you could say, oh, it's just hyperbolic language.
Yeah.
You know, they may have, you know, thought, he's just being over exaggerated. He's such a drama queen.
Exactly. And for any one instance, you can believe that. But when we put all of this together, that's where it gets interesting. And that's where it's like, okay, the odds of all of these things fitting, that's what we have to decide.
I would say back on the mother's thing on the previous slide, that might have been a little more understood because we see in the records of Kings and Chronicles that often the kings are associated with their mother.
Okay.
We do see that as we go through the Old Testament.
Yeah. Okay.
With the son
Yeah.
of heaven, it gives the mother's name.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah. It's still unusual, though, for David to be saying that he's basically been ostracized by everyone, particularly at this point in his life. So we're going to add given vinegar for his thirst as a way for us to test this solution. Psalm 69 is much like 22 in my book. If we look back on it, knowing what we know now, one can relate the entire chapter to the life of Jesus. Most of it would have been very hard, though, in my reading, for someone of that time to look forward and say, well, they're obviously talking about a solution. Looking back, it's much easier to do that. And we have to remember that this was a time where they knew the scriptures. They knew the Psalms. They would have been able to say, didn't David say something about that? And they would have had a very good recollection of these items. And so the fact that this is sitting there in the collection of things that they can look at is important to keep in mind as well. Any questions on that? We're done with what I'm going to point out in Psalms. There are various other things there, but they are not as obvious as the ones that I pointed out. By all means, though, dig in and figure out whatever you want. The Psalms is one of the books of poetry in the Ketuvim, which, as I'm sure you all recall, is the third section of the Hebrew Tanakh. Next, though, we're going to move to a book from the Nevi'im, which, as you recall, is the second section of the Hebrew Tanakh. So, as a reminder, Nevi'im, this is the second section. It has two parts. We have the former prophets and we have the latter prophets. The former prophets are mostly historical, Joshua, Judges, Samuels, and the Kings. And then we have the latter prophets. They're books that are, to this day, read in the synagogues, and they are studied extensively. So these are the prophetical books, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12 minor prophets. We're going to go to Isaiah. Chronologically speaking, that is the next book that we're going to look at. So let's look at how we go from David around 1000 BC to get to Isaiah. So up to now, we've been in this time frame of around 1000 BC here with David. And after David, we have Solomon. Solomon's son, Rehoboam, came onto the scene, and he implemented some policies that 10 of the tribes of Israel, in particular, did not care for. And we have a split. We have the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The 10 tribes of the north became known as the kingdom of Israel. The 2 tribes from the south became known as the kingdom of Judah. And that was Judah and Benjamin. The other 10 tribes all went with the kingdom of Israel. And each of these kingdoms proceeded onward. So you can see that this slide takes us to about 850 BC. And we have various kings that are setting along here. As we keep moving along, the northern 10 tribes, they had a lot of turmoil. They had a lot of pagan worship, and Jeroboam, in the blue on the upper section there, made things particularly bad in the 800 to 750 BC time frame. They were definitely not upholding their end of God's covenant, which said something to the effect of, I'll be your God, or if I will be your God, you will be my people. And so God was not being their God, so they had a lot of turmoil. And that's on the northern kingdom. This culminated in 722 BC with Assyria taking them over. It's important to note, though, that Assyria was not just a danger to the kingdom of Israel. Assyria was also wanting to take over the kingdom of Judah as well. You know, it's not like they finished the top part and said they were happy. They were a dominant force of this time. So Assyria was causing issues for the southern kingdom as well. But they took over the northern kingdom, 722 BC. On the southern side, if we go with the bottom half here, they had a few good kings, where I am defining good as meaning that they followed God, including Hezekiah, which is in the green down here. And that was, if you'll notice, that was around the same time that Assyria took over the northern kingdom. Perhaps the people turning back to God helped them out for a little bit, for a season. The book of Isaiah was written by a man named Isaiah. Isaiah was a prophet. I'm trying to throw you the soft one, you know, the easy one.
We're not used to that.
Yeah, exactly. So Isaiah was a prophet. He was not the first prophet, and he was not the last prophet. If we look at the prophets, we can see the time frames down here at the bottom. We can see that we start with Elijah, Elisha, Jonah, etc. And Elijah and Elisha in particular, and you know, they prophesied things that really applied to the northern kingdom. And then we quickly make our way down to Isaiah, right here in the
Upper third.
yeah, right up there. So that's Isaiah. So Isaiah was involved with the southern kingdom of Judah. And look at the time that he was active. It was in the 750 to 700 BC time frame. What do we know is going on in that time frame?
Assyria is taking over up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if it was 700 to
Northern.
750, I'm going to go back one slide. We can see that the Assyrian captivity was right there at 722. So this is the time frame that we're talking about with Isaiah. That's when Assyria had taken over, and even the southern kingdom, Assyria was threatening them. So we have that happening. And luckily they had good King Hezekiah for at least part of that period. But this is the scene when we drop into the book of Isaiah. This is what's been happening, just so that you have that connection between where we were at and where we're at now. Isaiah is both a prophetical as well as a historical book. There's a lot of description in the book about what was happening at that time in history. But Isaiah was called in chapter 6 to be a prophet. In chapter 6 we read, and Isaiah is talking, "Also I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" Note the plural, us, there. "Then I said, Here am I, send me." Isaiah volunteers. And he said, "Go and tell this people, keep on hearing, but do not understand. Keep on seeing, but do not perceive." Isaiah was going to have to share some things that were not going to be easy for the people to understand at that time. You'll hear it, you'll see it, but you might not get it. It might not be super clear when Isaiah says it. So that's what we're talking about here with the things that Isaiah is going to be prophesying. Some of the things that he's going to say are going to be very relevant to exactly what they were going through right then. Some of the things that he's going to say might not apply for hundreds of years. And those are the ones that we're more interested in. Continuing on, make the heart of this people dull, and their ears heavy, and shut their eyes, lest they see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and return and be healed. Indeed, the people will not hear. They're not going to see. They're not going to get it. God is describing here what Isaiah is prophesying is going to do. This is the effect that it's going to have on the people. They're going to hear Isaiah and they're not going to have a clue what he means. A lot of it's not going to make sense to them.
But it's purposeful.
But it's purposeful.
It's a mysterious message on purpose.
Yes, it's a mysterious message on purpose. That's a good way to look at it. Thoughts on that? Shortly after this, Isaiah, he spends a fair amount of time warning about God's judgment against the kingdom of Judah, the southern kingdom, and Jerusalem for their sins, because it's not like the southern kingdom was without sin. They had their issues. He also had several prophecies, though, about this ultimate solution to the relationship problem. We're going to pick up the story in Isaiah 7. So at this particular time, Ahaz is the king. So we don't yet have Hezekiah. Just as a little bit of background, in 2 Kings, which is the more historical side of this, we read, 20 years old was Ahaz when he began to reign, and he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem, and did not that which was right in the sight of the Lord his God, like David his father. Ahaz was not a good king. So Ahaz was the king right before Hezekiah. So Syria and the northern kingdom of Israel, both, the northern kingdom and Syria, were trying to take over the kingdom of Judah at this time. So we have a lot of turmoil happening. And God told Isaiah to tell Ahaz to not worry about it. Don't worry about them trying to take you over. The kingdom of Israel was soon going to be destroyed, the northern kingdom. God knew this. And Ahaz needed to believe it also. So God is trying to help Ahaz out, to help Ahaz believe. So we're going to pick up in chapter 7. Remember, Isaiah became a prophet in chapter 6. So very shortly after that, we're going to pick up in chapter 7. We have, moreover, the Lord spoke again to Ahaz, saying, ask a sign for yourself from the Lord your God. Ask it either in the depth or in the height above. So God tells Ahaz, ask for a sign. I want you to believe. I want to prove to you. Ask for a sign. Whatever you want, high or low, just ask. God was not asking Ahaz to believe everything he was saying without backing it up. God was saying, Ahaz, ask for a sign. Question is, though, does Ahaz want to believe what God is telling him? Verse 12. But Ahaz said, I will not ask, nor will I test the Lord. Ahaz is not serious. God explicitly told him to ask for a sign to help his disbelief. Ahaz doesn't want to help his disbelief, so he makes up an excuse that he doesn't want to test God, even though God explicitly told him, ask for a sign. So Ahaz says, I don't want to test you. But God says, test me. God told him to do that. Verse 13. Then he said, hear now, O house of David, is it a small thing for you to weary men, but will you weary my God also? God's response is that Ahaz might think he can trick other people, but does he really think he can trick God? Is that what he thinks? I mean, seriously. God has very graciously told Ahaz to not believe just because. God wanted to give a sign to Ahaz, but Ahaz rejected. So God says, listen up, house of David. God chose to address the entire house of David. Hear now, house of David, is it a small thing for you to weary men, but will you weary my God also? Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Can't you just anticipate what might be coming? God's about to drop a truth bomb. It might be something you've heard before. Seemingly out of the blue, God goes very far beyond Ahaz and his petty issues. Verse 14, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. The Hebrew word Imanu means with us, and El means God. So together they form the compound name Emmanuel, with us God, or as we English speakers like to say, God with us. "700 years BC. We're going to add born of a virgin on here. I'm going to throw a fly in the ointment though. If we're looking for what to look for, how is any remotely logical person going to be able to say in a practical sense whether or not someone is born of a virgin? Only one person actually knows if she's a virgin or not. But this is what we're being told. But it's kind of curious, though, whenever we think about that. Who's to say this is something that we take by faith? Thoughts? Another way that we can test the solution, God with us. Will the solution somehow be God with us? What would that even mean? Hard to say before it happens, but looking back on it, we might have a better idea. This would have made pretty much no sense. What in the world would God with us mean? We're going to move forward a little bit in Isaiah. He's sharing more prophecies. Again, the kingdom of Judah doesn't need to worry about Syria and the kingdom of Israel, but the Assyrians are coming. The northern kingdom is soon going to fall to the Assyrians, and they'll take Judah up to the neck. But Jerusalem itself will survive. And through all this, Isaiah assures Judah that God will stay with them. And we are out of time. The next thing that I want to get into is going to take longer to go through than we have. So we're going to stop here. Questions on that? Got lots of pretty maps and everything else coming up, but I don't want to get started on that.
I was just kind of thinking through, like your previous slide. You know, we know that the Jews struggled to look back during Jesus' day and see that, but yet the wise men recognized it.
The born of a virgin?
Well, specifically the star.
Oh, absolutely.
And stuff
Yeah.
like that. And the wise men of that day recognized that it was prophecy.
Yep.
And we're looking for it.
They were looking for it. But others weren't.
They had to plan, they had a trip to plan.
Yep. And these turmoils, the wise men were looking for the star. The people in Israel were not. And a lot of the other stuff we've talked about are things that I have been wrestling with in my mind on whether or not this is proof and what we're supposed to get out of this entire study. And I want you to do the same. Think about these things. Think about, why did it happen the way it happened? Why did God share what he shared and only what he shared? And what were the people thinking? Why are some people getting one thing out of it that other people can't see?
A few slides back,
Yeah.
it was a portion of scripture, and the very first word I think was made.
Make.
That?
Make
Okay.
the heart of his people dull.
Yep.
That's why.
God might have had something to do with it. I can tell you right now, in case you haven't figured it out, we're not going to wrap this up in a nice, tight, pretty bow. You're going to have to think about it. And you're going to have to reason out what we're seeing here. I can tell you that we're seeing a lot of things that point very convincingly to Jesus, Whether or not they would have thought that at the time, you have to figure that out, and you have to figure out why you think they might or might not have thought that.
Well, it's interesting too, as you just look at the verses on the screen, had they had hearts and ears, they would have been healed.
Yes.
Too soon, maybe. But not too soon, but
Not in God's plan.
not in God's plan.
Yeah, not in-
Right.
not in His timing.
Not in His timing.
Yeah. Yeah. So I want you to leave each time feeling like you know a little bit more about the picture, but I want there to be a little bit of unease in your mind about what you're really thinking about this. Yeah.
The mystery was hidden, but yet it's right there. It was
Yes.
revealed
Yeah.
through the whole thing.
Hidden in plain sight.
Yeah, hidden in plain sight.
Yeah.
I had written in my Bible somewhere, they can't see the forest for the trees.
Yep, God's plan.
God's plan and God's time.